Decided to suspend what I had originally planned to do as a show today because I just got the news this morning that a good friend of mine and a mentor passed away. His name is Senator Mike Gravel. I met Mike Gravel in 2008 and I worked for his campaign as a paid consultant, more along the lines of trying to help him understand how to talk to libertarians because at the time I was a libertarian. I still am a libertarian in the leftist sense of the word, but anyway, Senator Gravel filibustered to end the draft. He read the Pentagon Papers into the public record, exposing lies of Vietnam. To help you understand what that was, it was basically like taking WikiLeaks and reading them into the congressional record so that they became public knowledge. He was prosecuted for doing that, and fortunately enough, was able to fight that off. But he was a senator from Alaska. He ran for president in 2008 against Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton. That was actually the time that Barack Obama won the nomination. But he had a lot in common with people like Bernie Sanders, Dennis Kucinich. As far as policies, he was a progressive. But what I think my right leaning audience, at least, should be able to appreciate about him was that he was very vocally anti war, which is why I called him a warrior for peace. He was fiery during the debates. He was not afraid to, call people out. To those of you who are, I guess, disappointed that Bernie, pulled some punches, well, if Senator Gravel had been on the stage, you definitely wouldn't be dealing with that. If anything, it would be more like, wow, Mike, calm down a little bit. He went right for the juggler. And that was his position on things, in addition to the fact that, as far as what he taught me as an activist was to do my own research, do my own thinking. One of the things he told me when I was working for him was, I don't want to surround myself with sycophants. If you think I'm doing something wrong, I want you to tell me. If you think I've got something wrong, I want you to talk to me about it. It was a very great experience, and honestly, probably the biggest honor of my life to work for Senator Mike Gravel. He ran again in 2020, kind of into the understanding that he was hoping to get into the debates again to call out Joe Biden. And I really wish he had had that opportunity because he would have kneecapped him for sure. He would have done the things that people like Bernie were not going to do. And to those of you who are like new to activism now, maybe you weren't around for 2008 or maybe you weren't thinking about politics back then, you guys don't realize how good you have it because people like Mike, fought to get into the debates, fought to stay in the debates. Mike continued his campaign even when, fundraising dried up. He literally, as an elderly man, would ride in a bus to get to debates. And they got rid of him as fast as they could. And one of the reasons why I think will be exposed in one of the video clips that I'm about to show. But it was when he kind of took out Hillary Clinton by pointing out that she had been lying about being an anti-war candidate because she had just voted in favor of a resolution that could have theoretically allowed George Bush to attack Iran. So I will seriously miss, being able to talk to him. I'm including in here like the last broadcast that I did with him. He was 91 years old, so, it was just a matter of time. But, even in the last days I did talk to him, it was, the guy was still very clear, very strong willed. And he was a voice for progressive politics and for anti war politics that will be surely missed. And one of the things I encountered in 2008 while working for him was just people didn't have any sense of history, particularly when it comes to war politics. For him to filibuster to end the draft is the main reason why many of you younger people are not drafted and off fighting in the war on terror. The fact that he risked his life, to read top secret documents into the public record, is again, like it was a life changing thing that helped to end the Vietnam War and to expose the power that the military industrial complex had in continuing that war. So I hope that you can take a while to listen to this and maybe to investigate Mike Gravel a little closer. This particular broadcast talked about one of the other major elements that Mike Gravel supported, which was direct democracy. Senator Gravel, after being in the Senate for years as a maverick senator, just kind of came to the conclusion that representative government, meaning we pick people to make our decisions for us, was just not working. And he started to do the investigations into how to pass a constitutional amendment that would allow us as the citizens of the United States to be able to propose laws and vote on them. Similar in some regards to the referendums you might vote on statewide. The idea being is that if your legislature is not going to get something done, then you're going to have to do it yourself as the people. And he did a lot of research into the way the founding fathers wanted things done, and in some cases, how the founding fathers themselves were not necessarily, the greatest representatives of freedom that we all think. He was by no means anti-American. He just represented a portion of the viewpoint that was that the founding fathers themselves were plutocrats. They were wealthy people who had their own interests, and that ironically, one of the major reasons that we don't still use direct democracy to make a lot of big decisions is because they kept trying to ratify the Constitution with slavery in it. And when we were doing direct democratic methods of ratifying the Constitution, there were several states that would not ratify the Constitution unless slavery was made illegal. There were also several states that would not ratify the Constitution unless slavery was legal. So in order to circumvent this effort, they basically convinced everybody that it was better to elect delegates to make your decisions for you. We call those delegates now congressmen and senators and the president. And the system is broken. That's something that Mike just kind of felt over and over again, that the only way that he could get anything done in the Senate generally was to cheat, to filibuster, or, read top secret documents into the public record. There were no just direct options available to him, or really to anybody who wanted to make positive change. If we had enacted his national initiative concepts, Medicare for all being in, the majority of, the United States wants it, could be passed. If a politician dropped below, 30% approval rating, you could just get rid of them, whether it's a congressman or a senator, in a recall election, which they still do in the States. But basically, since it gets talked about in the podcast that I'm going to be sharing, and I don't want to go too much more into it, but, you're talking about a guy who fought his whole life to expose, the corruption in the government and to try to give us the tools to be able to take it back and to make it work for ourselves. I will seriously miss you, Mike. I was at a loss for words about how I felt about it. I had to process it and think about, what role he played in my life in formulating the kind of activist that I am today. So anyway, I hope you will tune in till the end, where he gives me probably one of the best compliments I've ever gotten from him as a mentor. And, as I told him about the things he was complimenting me on, I had a good teacher. Thank you for what you did for this country, Senator Gravel. You will be missed.
And former Alaska Senator Mike Gravel. Senator, thank you. And Senator Gravel, for those who may not be familiar with your past, 2 terms U.S. Senate from Alaska, you played a role in the fight to cut off money for the Vietnam War. What would be your advice, Senator, for the elected officials on this stage who are at a conflict, opposed to the conflict, but also feel the need to keep on funding the conflict?
Well, first off, understand that this war was lost the day that George Bush invaded Iraq on a fraudulent basis. Understand that. Now, with respect to what's going on in the Congress, I'm really embarrassed. So we passed, and the media is in a frenzy right today with what has been passed. What has been passed? George Bush communicated over a year ago that he would not get out of Iraq until he left office. Do we not believe him? We need to find another way. That's where I really would like to sit down with Pelosi and with Reid, and I would hope the other senators would focus on how do you get out? you pass a law, not a resolution, a law, making it a felony to stay there. And I'll give you the text of it. And if you're worried about filibuster, here's what you do tactically. They can pass it in the House. We got the votes there. In the Senate, let them filibuster it. And let Reid call up at 12 o'clock every day to have a cloture vote and let the American people see clearly who's keeping the war going and who's not. And that's just the beginning of the tactic if they're tough enough to do it.
Senator Gravel, at a forum earlier this year, I want to get this right, you said it doesn't matter whether you are elected president or not. So then why are you here tonight? Shouldn't debates be for candidates who are in the race to win the race?
Ryan, you're right. I made that statement. But that's before I had a chance to stand with them three times. It's like going into the Senate. You know, the first time you get there, you're all excited. My God, how did I ever get here? Then about 6 months later, you say, how the hell did the rest of them get here? And I got to tell you, after standing up with them, some of these people frighten me. They frighten me. When you have mainline candidates that turn around and say that there's nothing off the table with respect to Iran, that's code for using nukes, nuclear devices. I got to tell you, I'm President of the United States. There will be no preemptive wars with nuclear devices. To my mind, it's immoral, and it's been immoral for the last 50 years as part of American foreign policy.
Let's use a little moderator discretion here. Senator Gravel, that's a weighty charge. Who on this stage exactly tonight worries you so much?
Well, I would say the top-tier ones. The top-tier ones. They've made statements. Oh, Joe, I'll include you, too. You have a certain arrogance. You want to tell the Iraqis how to run their country. I got to tell you, we should just plain get out. Just plain get out. It's their country. They're asking us to leave, and we insist on staying there. And why not get out? What harm is it going to do? Oh, you hear the statement, well, my God, these soldiers will have died in vain. The entire deaths of Vietnam died in vain. And they're dying in vain right this very second. And you know what's worse than a soldier dying in vain is more soldiers dying in vain. That's what's worse.
Short answer question, one sentence, and I'm going to ask each of you, beginning with Senator Gravel. This is from Paula in Conway, South Carolina. What is the most significant political or professional mistake you have made in the past 4 years, and what, if anything, did you learn from this mistake which makes you a better candidate? And make the sentence no longer than 20 seconds, okay? Senator Gravel.
I've just grown up. I'm the senior statesman on here, and I was beginning to feel like a potted plant standing over here. But let me point out to you, in one sentence, I won't hold their youth and inexperience against them.
Thank you, sir. Representative.
Same question. Other than Iraq, three most important enemies to the United States.
We have no important enemies. What we need to do is to begin to deal with the rest of the world as equals, and we don't do that. We spend more as a nation on defense than all the rest of the world put together. Who are we afraid of? Who are you afraid of, Brian? I'm not. And Iraq has never been a threat to us. We invaded them. I mean, it is unbelievable. The military-industrial complex not only controls our government, lock, stock, and barrel, but they control our culture.
Senator Gravel, a chance. Senator Gravel, I've listened to you very carefully in this campaign. You were in the Senate.
You're one of the few that has.
You were in the Senate, and you take credit for stopping the draft. If you were a senator right now, what advice would you give your colleagues still in Congress about how they can stop the war, even though they don't have enough votes to stop a debate or to override a veto? What should they do?
Well, the first thing, you stop the debate by voting every single day on cloture. Every day. 20 days, and you'll overcome cloture. The president vetoes the law. It comes back to the Congress, and in the House at noon, every single day, you vote to override the president's veto. And in 40 days, the American people will have weighed in, put the pressure on those. You tell me that the votes aren't there, you go get them by the scruff of the neck. That's what you do. You make them vote.
Senator, are you suggesting that these candidates suspend their campaigns, go back to Washington, and for 40 consecutive days vote on the war?
If it stops the killing, my God, yes, do it.
Tim.
And Tim, you're really missing something. This is fantasy land. We're talking about ending the war. My God, we're just starting a war right today. There was a vote in the Senate today. Joe Lieberman, who authored the Iraq resolution, has authored another resolution, and it is essentially a fig leaf to let George Bush go to war with Iran. And I want to congratulate Biden for voting against it, Dodd for voting against it, and I'm ashamed of you, Hillary, for voting for it. You're not going to get another shot at this, because what's happened, if this war ensues, we invade, and they're looking for an excuse to do it. And Obama was not even there to vote.
Senator Clinton, I want to give you a chance to respond.
So those were some of the highlights from the debates from 2008, where Mike really took it to the people in charge, and despite the bad treatment that he got, still managed to persevere and push on, and he continued his campaign until the very end. So now coming up is the podcast that I did with him back on Blog Talk Radio. So the sound quality is going to be a little rough, but that's a Blog Talk thing. And I hope that you guys will investigate direct democracy as a possible solution for our problems in this country. So here we go. Tonight, it's actually my intention to talk about the 2020 election and the COVID-19 epidemic. And my guest is Senator Mike Gravel. Senator Mike Gravel was a Vietnam-era senator who read the Pentagon Papers into the public record to expose lies about Vietnam. He also filibustered to end the draft, which at this point, a lot of this generation in particular should appreciate that, because if they do try to go to war in some of the regime change wars that Tulsi Gabbard speaks about, it is exactly the young millennial generation that would be recruited unwittingly into such wars. Mike Gravel was a very good personal friend of mine and a mentor in 2008 during my candidacy for Congress, as well as I was one of his delegates during his brief time with the Libertarian Party. So I want to thank you, Mike, for coming on tonight. Welcome back to V Radio. Oh, got to activate his mic.
Considerably older than I was then. In fact, I'll be 90 years old in May. But I still follow events very closely, and just finished a book and got it to the publisher last August. And it's out there, but we haven't officially launched it yet.
I apologize. Part of what you had said was cut off because I'm a little green and I had to remember, or rusty rather, and I had to remember to turn it back on. But we did hear about your book and the fact that you were 90. It's good to have you back. Now, I wanted to ask you, first of all, one of the things that kind of spiked my interest and really brought back some memories was that you went ahead and put your name in the lot for the 2020 presidential election. What made you decide to do that?
Well, I really didn't put my name in. It was a group of three teenagers, 18 years old. Two of them were at Columbia, and one was at Oxford. And they approached me, David Oakes approached me asking me to run for president. And I said, David, do you realize how old I am? He says, well, that doesn't make any difference. What we're interested in is pushing you to get on the stage like you did in 2008 and talk about the issues because essentially you were sort of a Bernie Sanders before Bernie Sanders. And I wasn't decided to do that. And so he said, well, maybe we could just do an exploratory filing. And I said, okay. Then they came back after that and said, well, there's a good response. We'd like to have you run officially so that you could get into the debates. Well, I said, fine. And then they get back at me and say, well, you're getting a lot of reaction, but we can't get over the obstacle that you keep saying you don't care to get into the debates, or you don't care to run for president. And they said, can we file the papers for president? And I said, yes, go ahead. And the criteria is I will not travel. I'll respond to any interview. But all of the activities got to be taken care by you, the three of you. Well, actually, it was by 4 or 5 at this point. And what they did is they raised over $300,000. They advertised the campaign and just used all the money to roll it back into expanding the views that we hold. After the campaign was over, what happened is the Democratic Party did the same thing to me that they did in '08. They turned around and wouldn't grant me the opportunity to be on the stage, even though I qualified. But at this point in time, I didn't really want to get into a hassle, and so I just let it ride, and they just cut us out of the tribe in that regard. But the kids kept on working, and of course our deal was that I would run, but at the point when I withdraw, I would endorse Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard, because I wanted to. There's two slots, president and vice president, and my hope was for Bernie to select Tulsi as his running mate, which would have been ideal because their views are identical. And Tulsi is one of the most courageous persons I know, and similarly with Bernie. So that would be a natural, and we did. I endorsed both of them, and of course I continued to respond to interviews. And when Bernie came out here to San Jose, I live in Seaside, California, and he came out to San Jose. My wife and I drove to San Jose to be at the rally. And then I met privately with him, and it was like old folks at home, hugging each other. And to my knowledge, that was the first time I physically met him, and I think he me, but he knew me from the '08 experience of fighting the same issues that he's fighting for, and of course knew me from the Senate experience when I released the Pentagon Papers and did a whole bunch of other things. So Bernie and I are very compatible, and I hope to meet with, and of course I'm very distressed at this point in time as to what's happening between Bernie and Biden.
Well, yeah, I would definitely I'm pretty distressed about it too, and honestly, I think really a big part of the frustration that I have is that in many cases, part of it is just that the voters are not educated, particularly about Biden's record. I mean, I know that the first impression that I had was like, oh boy, Mike wants to get on stage again. I know exactly what he's going to do. And they included that clip of you calling out Biden back when you were calling out Hillary. I think I could even quote it. I've listened to it so many times. You're like, oh, Joe, I'll include you too. You have a certain arrogance. You want to tell the Iraqi people how to live their lives. And I'll tell you, why don't we just play Get Out? It's their country. Let's get out.
God damn,
your
you do have
anti-war
that
was
down
excellent.
pat.
Well, yeah, I had a good teacher, but that your links to especially like the old debates in 2008, and particularly when you called out Hillary on the fact that she was trying to say she was an anti-war candidate, and then she voted for that resolution that would have allowed Bush to attack Iran. And it was hilarious to me, and I can't ever really actually prove this, but I had always kind of felt that was a moment, one of the tipping moments where Barack Obama basically tore ahead of Hillary. Not that he was really a superior candidate in my view, since, I think he was pro-war as well. But regardless, those moments in particular, that was in 2008, the campaigns. That's the other thing that I noticed that changed considerably between then and now was that, in 2008, they got rid of you as fast as they could. They got rid of Dennis Kucinich. And, one of the things that I remind the Republicans about, because now they're all acting like, well, that's just the corruption of the DNC. And I was like, no, they did the same thing to Ron Paul in 2008. And one of the things I also point out to them is that this wouldn't have been any different. The only reason, they wanted to get rid of Donald Trump as well. He's anti-establishment. I don't approve of him, but still, the GOP didn't want him, and the only reason they couldn't get rid of him is because he threatened to run third party, and you and I both know the Libertarian Party would have fallen all over themselves to get him on their ticket, and then in addition to that, he had his own money, so he would have, wrecked them if he had done that, but they wanted Cruz or one of their other stuffed shirt establishment guys. They certainly didn't want him, but now they're stuck with him, overall in general, I remember thinking to myself how amazing it would have been because you would have, basically walked up there with a verbal crowbar and hit Biden over the head. And Bernie, he did get around to kind of doing that now, but he has been trying to play a clean game, and I understand what he's up to. I think that part of the problem that I'm having right now is that a lot of the people that did support him, like people like Jimmy Dore, for example, are kind of hammering on him, saying that he wasn't aggressive enough. But at the same time, there's all these weird goings on with the votes, like the exit polls are not matching what people are voting. And, you don't want to be a crazy conspiracy nut, but we are talking about the party that's on record, during their defense of the lawsuit from the 2016 election, saying we're allowed to just pick whoever we want. We can pick them in back rooms. And unfortunately, the judge agreed because the political parties are not constitutional. A lot of people are not even aware of that. They're not part of the Constitution. They weren't intended to be part of the Constitution. It's essentially an extra layer to our democracy that was never intended. And George Washington, in his farewell address, made it very clear that he had very serious reservations, that he was worried about the fact that eventually people would start to worry more about what was good for their party and not what was good for their country. And that's exactly what happened. He might as well have been Nostradamus. He was absolutely right. And it's frustrating because, in addition to that, another element of it that bothers me is that our politics are packaged. Like we're basically told, well, if you either have to be party A or party B. So for example, despite leaning left, I'm pro-gun rights. So where do I fit? I can't really be a Democrat because, if you start talking about pro-gun rights, then they immediately assume you're a Republican. But I am pro-welfare. But then you're told, well, if you feel that way, then you can't be, a Republican. So it's like, and those two things don't even relate. They're not even involved with one another. But we're forced and essentially pigeonholed into one of these two groups. And I think that at the end of the day, there's a whole lot of people that are just left by the wayside. And I wish we could just do away with the party system altogether and have people run as individuals. Now, you did a lot of studying, obviously, in the early days of the drafting in the Constitution. And it was actually your book, Citizen Power, that really brought me to the fact that the Founding Fathers were largely plutocrats, that they weren't trying to protect everybody. They were trying to protect their wealth. Madison being quoted as the wealth of the nation should rule the nation. And so I wanted to give you a moment, Mike, to talk about this and also how it relates to direct democracy and how the colonies used to govern themselves by direct democracy. And then we got basically convinced that we should accept this delegate system of electing some other rich guy to do all of our thinking. Go ahead.
Well, that's the whole thesis of representative government. And representative government has been very successful in hanging on to power because when you look at the various nations that have gone from tyrannies to what we call democracies and are not, then you come to the conclusion that, well, what's going on? Why do the same people who were in power under the tyranny when they were absorbed into representative government, they still had control? Well, because the reason why people have copied us, and there's only two forms of what we call democracies. One's the parliamentary system in Britain, and the other is the constitutional system in the United States. And both are designed for the easy transfer of power to the elites who govern society. And so I've railed against that in what you remember as Citizen Power, but more so in the new book that I have out there now, and that's The Failure of Representative Government and the Solution. A legislature of the people is the solution. And the book, the failure book, is only 120 pages long, and it essentially on the back says it's the manual to create and to operate a legislature for the people. Now, with respect to, I rely on the Constitution as the precursor that permits us to do this, to bring this about. Right now, the representative government has a monopoly on lawmaking. Let me say that again. The Congress has a monopoly on lawmaking. Why can't the people, why can't the people make laws? Well, because the Founding Fathers didn't want them to make laws. They didn't trust the people. They didn't trust them generically, but then they didn't trust them because of putting slavery into the Constitution. And so they wanted to protect slavery, and the only way you could do that is to keep the people at arm's length from the drafting process in Philadelphia and the ratification process in the subsequent conventions of with 9 states. The standard, if you get the conventions of 9 states that ratify this Constitution, it becomes the Constitution of those 9 states. That was illegal in a sense because the Confederation Congress could only be altered. The text could only be altered unanimously, and obviously that wasn't going to happen because Rhode Island didn't even show up at the convention in Philadelphia. But what set the stage was that in Article 9, which of course is the precedent for what we're doing in enacting a legislature of the people, Article 9 says that when the conventions of 9 states ratify this legislation or this constitutional amendment, it becomes the law of that state. And so not only 9 states, they were followed subsequently by essentially all the states that exist, the 50 that exist in the United States today. And they've all gone through the same process of ratifying the Constitution de novo in a certain process. Now, what we have is we can do the same thing. We can say that the technology exists to literally ask the American people if they wish to be lawmakers, if they wish to set up a legislature of the people. And now that would take a constitutional amendment to do that. And the package that we have for the legislature of the people is one, a constitutional amendment which sets up the process so that it can't be touched by the Congress or the Supreme Court. And then the other is setting up a Legislative Procedures Act so that the making of laws becomes a very deliberative process. Otherwise, if you just give people the right to make laws, it becomes anarchy. And that obviously is not an intelligent way to run the boat. So with the process that we have right now, we ask the people if they wish to become lawmakers. And if they respond, and the standard of the immediate response is that more than 50% of the people who voted in the presidential election, most recent, have to vote in the affirmative for this constitutional amendment and this legislative act. And once that happens, it becomes the law of the land. Now, what we would do in the conduct of that election, now keep in mind, this is an election that will be handled by voluntary private citizens. And the organization will probably call itself Philadelphia 2. And these citizens then will conduct an election that would be more transparent, more informative than any other election conducted by any government in the world, and most assuredly the United States. And
well,
so
let me take a moment just to break this down for our listeners who are not as well versed in this. Essentially, to what you're listening to is Mike is describing his idea for a constitutional amendment that would allow us to have referendums to pass new laws. It could also be used to recall politicians. There are actually countries right now, I believe Switzerland, for example, if you're going to take the Swiss army to war, there has to actually be a referendum. It has to be approved by referendum. There isn't any one person, unless it's an emergency, who can simply take them to war. And if for some reason a war in Switzerland fell below the people's approval rating, then they could have another referendum and recall it. So essentially what he's discussing is the idea of bringing federal referendums for people to be able to vote on new laws and new policies and perhaps even recall people. So we don't end up a scenario like approval rating and then we just have to tolerate him for 3 years because we can't get rid of him. With this kind of legislation, we could recall him. Now, is all of that still correct? It's been a while since you and I talked about this, Mike.
Yes, it is, but I prefer to use the word a legislative proposal rather than referendum. A referendum is where the government refers something to the people, and all they can do is vote yes or no. And so that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about you and I, or if we decide we want to introduce legislation to stop a war from happening, or to, let's say, we want a legislature. So we have the legislature of the people, and so we have all of the details that they need to operate a legislature. And they're all laid out in this Legislative Procedures Act. So here, we sanction it with the Constitutional Amendment. We set up the procedures so it's a deliberative process. And then we now open it to the public. We go through the process of getting the legislation. You and I have this legislation. We get it through the process. It then becomes the law of the land. That's what this book, the failure of representative government, because I set up the failure so that we can show why it's a failure. And then
I agree wholeheartedly on that. I think to try to bring this around to where people will understand why this is relevant, you end up in a scenario where we have this frustration that, for example, we can't pass Medicare for all. We can't pass maternity leave, et cetera. A lot of the different things that Bernie wants to pass, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party just can't ever seem to get, can't get anything done. And that's what I remember you pointing out to me back in your day, was that essentially in order to get anything done as a maverick in the Senate, you more or less just had to find ways around them, like whether it was the filibuster or reading the Pentagon Papers, that this would empower people to be able to make their own legislation. And what you're explaining is the system in question that basically makes sure that, we don't just pass laws that are not necessarily good laws.
Well, that's right. And of course, this is open to anybody who can get 40% of the people in this poll that want to consider the legislation. That's very critical, because what happens in the Congress, anybody can introduce anything, and they do. And then it's up to the leadership that then determines who will have their legislation considered. Now, when you got a crazy like Mitch McConnell in there, you can't get any intelligent legislation as long as he's in power. And the Democrats, many times they don't do much better in their approach. So the party system, in fact, you alluded to the party system. Even before the revolution, it was generally accepted knowledge that parties were factions and were very bad things. And so what had happened, this was the conventional wisdom of the time, and then lo and behold, George Washington gets elected president unanimously, and then in the first year of his term, you have the fight breaking out between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. And then that fight separated into factions. And we've been living with factions ever since. And you're quite right when you stated that there's no activity, political activity, that can take place basically within the two parties without the understanding that if you want to appoint a judge, he's got to comport to the faction. If you want to appoint officials, they got to comport to the faction that they're aligned with. And there's not a mention of that in the Constitution. And it's the most corrupting influence, because the factions are only interested in acquiring power, just to have the power. Whether they use it for any beneficial purpose remains to be seen. They just want the power. And that's what we see today in the election, that with respect to what's happening to Bernie, and understand that it's not just the Democratic Party right now. It's that the American public has been so misinformed about Bernie's agenda that they don't recognize that by voting for Biden, they're voting against their own self-interest. It's going to happen. And this is because the power of our capitalist society interlaced with our political power is so frightened of the changes that Bernie will make. And I can tell you that once we enact the citizens, the legislature of the people, Bernie's agenda will go through it easily, and that will really make the changes that we need, because the Congress will never do it, and so I've recognized that. And I think Bernie and I are going to have a conversation after the convention as to how we go forward, because we need him and his organization. He kept his organization alive from 16 to the present. Now he's got to keep it alive, and one of the ways he can keep it alive is functioning as the major force. My kids are doing the same thing, as a major force to bring about this enactment of this manual to create and to operate a legislature of the people. That's the goal. And so we need to first educate the American people as to why it's efficacious for them to be lawmakers, and why we have to stop the monopoly that exists in Congress in making laws, representatives. And so once we can accomplish that, then we start the electoral process to go out there. And now this is going to be an expensive operation, make no mistake about it. It's the equivalent of a presidential election, but that's what it takes when you're trying to repair the damage that was done by the founders in the Constitution. To repair that damage, it takes a fundamental lift by the people to understand what they're doing and to enact it.
Time. Also, so Mike, to talk a little bit about what's going on right now, as we've already discussed some of the problems with the election system as it's going. We've discussed issues about, just how, Bernie's policies, essentially that the establishment is terrified of such an idea. And I think that honestly, we're kind of to a point where it almost seems like they'd rather lose to Trump again than allow the progressives to get a foothold in the Democratic Party. And would you say that's true?
No, I wouldn't entirely agree with that. There may be elements of that, but no, they're frightened of Trump, the establishment, whether it's the capitalist establishment or they've enjoyed the tax breaks that Trump has given them, but that's all going by the boards. What's happening with the virus is so overwhelming to human society on a global basis that it shook everything to the bottom. What Trump is going to be looking at as he runs for re-election is going to be a stock market that's in the toilet. He's going to be looking at the approach that he's taking, which is ridiculous. He thought that this virus was a hoax, and all of his statements it'll be easy to just do spot after spot, video, radio, quoting Trump and his stupidity. And so he may have his base intact, but what the virus has done has pushed this far beyond any partisanship. And so that's the reason why the establishment, the Democrats and the broader establishment, is so frightened by Trump, in whether he's handling the virus or handling the economy, with all these trade tariffs and so on. He's turned the clock back to the early 30s. And so we've got to solve the problem with tariffs, which are essentially Smoot-Hawley tariffs. We've got to solve the problem with Glass-Steagall, so we can separate the banks. Actually, we have to correct the banks. We have to really take over the Federal Reserve, which of course is owned and operated by the bankers. And I'm very fond of Ellen Brown's concept of public banking. And we got that passed in California, and I think that has to be worldwide, nationwide, certainly. And that's one of the things we could enact into law, if the people were able to make the laws and not just rely upon just as an aside, what will happen to representative government? It will be grossly improved, because the people will essentially fall into the traces of setting policy, and the implementation of policy will be done by representative government. And if they don't implement it properly, the people can turn around and correct it and pass it again. Now, what you have to understand, when you empower the people to make laws, they are the sovereigns. The creation of the sovereign is the Supreme Court, the executive, and the Congress. And they are superior to all of those departments. And so the people, as lawmakers, are independent of representative government. And that's the flaw with the initiative process coming out of Switzerland, is that they turned around and left the politicians, the elected representatives, in charge of the process, which weakens it. And so when the initiative process was copied in the United States, in the various initiative states, the process is corrupted because it's still in the hands of representatives. And the representatives do everything in their power to sabotage any possibility that the people could make laws as they do. They're protecting power. It's really all about power. And so now when you give the people the power to make laws, it is immutable. It will change everything fundamentally. Now, you could say, well, what if Congress passes something and the people are against it and they change it, and then Congress passes it again? Well, very simply, the people could wipe out Congress. Let me repeat. The people become the superior power in human governance because it is made up of human beings governing themselves in a legislative process. This is the only arena where you can bring the people into the operation of government. You can't bring the people, the millions of people, into the judiciary. They can't bring them into the Congress, and you can't bring them into other facets of government. But the legislature is open-ended. You can have a legislature with millions of people voting. Once the process is set up, it will go around the world like wildfire. Because of course, because it's important that the total package be there, because you don't want anarchy. You don't want violence. You want an evolutionary process to make the law. And so why we have violence now and protest is because the representative government is failing. There's no two ways about it. Just read that one chapter, and I don't go, hell, you could write volumes on the failure of representative government. I just touch on a few items to make the point very clearly that the United States, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, the Dutch at the time, these were all representative governments that ran the government, and they committed crimes ad nauseum, including the United States overwhelmingly. And so I treat that in there and then set the stage to now analyze the Constitution for you, and then from that analysis show you how we can enact this legislature of the people in this process. And then after that, I have a little chapter there that shows you all the issues that you could then enact into law if the people had the opportunity to do that. And these issues here, we need to have term limits for members of Congress. For the House, we change it from 2 years to 4 years and 3 terms, 12 years. From the Senate, there's a term limit, 2 terms, you're out. All federal judges, including the Supreme Court of the United States, would be term limited to 12 years. Can you begin to see how that would change the operation of our society? when that is put in place. And that's just the beginning of the things that need to. I have a whole list of the things, and then at the end, I have a chapter on the 21st century, and I'll tell you, I deal with Russia, China, and the problems that we will have with with atomic energy. Will destroy the planet through two ways: one with atomic energy, or with the environment that we're despoiling, and that will happen by the end of this century. So this is the only opportunity we have. It's not going to be done by representative government. We see that. It's got to be done by the people, and the people will do it if they have the tools to do it, and that's what this is all about. And this book is the manual to develop and to operate a legislature of the people. And I used to use initiative, but initiative lawmaking is not all that understood. People understand a legislative proposal, and that's why I've changed the rhetoric to try and make it more user-friendly because I've been at this for 25, 30 years. So
right.
What's happened in this text I put forward, it didn't jump on the table. It took a great deal of reflection, research, and analysis of the founding of our country and how a legislature works. It's and I have the fortune of having been in the legislature, having been in command of the legislature in Alaska, and so so if you read the book, to put it down, you can read it in one sitting. Put it down, then wait a month and read it again, and you'll see more in it. The nuances in this thing are extraordinary, and there was no compromise. See, what happens a lot of times in legislation, you compromise it and thereby neutering the effect of the legislation. This did not happen. This was written over a period of 25, 30 years, vetted by speaking around the country to law schools, and vetted with colleagues and friends of mine who served on the board of Direct Democracy, and most of them are my age and have gone to their greater rewards. But thank God for my longevity, because we can. Here, when I wrote the book, I started last October, which was 89 years old, and I finished it in August. I was just so grateful to finish it and get it off to the publishers, because this is probably the last thing that I could do with any coherence. Now, I can talk about it, and will, once we get on the campaign trail, because this is a campaign. The campaign is to enact this, to take this book, put it in front of the American people, let them understand it, and then let them vote on creating a legislature of the people. That's the task that's involved, which means that we got to sell the book overwhelmingly, and then use the proceeds to advertise the book to get more sales and more understanding. We need the American people to understand this before we start an election. And that's what the task is at hand. And if I can persuade Bernie and Tulsi and Tom Steyer, who has really articulated some very language. Now, whether that he has the depth behind the language remains to be seen. And that's what the book is about. You can say, oh, I'm for the people. Yeah. Well, tell me what the people are going to do and how they're going to do it. That's, of course, is exactly what's happening, what I put forth in this book. When people say, oh, I'm for the people, well, tell me how the people are going to do it now.
That's definitely, it's appealing to me, and I think that one of the things that I've always had to deal with in the past, especially when arguing with libertarians
I'm
about
having
this.
a little trouble hearing you. Can you speak up?
Can you hear me now? Are you hearing me okay?
Yeah.
All right, good. What I was going to say is one of the problems I've always had when I was trying to explain why democracy was superior to just, representative government was the fact that essentially our representatives essentially only represent their donors. In the long run, they have to. That's just the way the system is designed. They're in a situation where they have to represent whatever corporate interests are willing to pay them. Bernie has been able to accomplish something pretty unique in that he's managed to have this strong campaign that he's had, mostly just with small dollar donations.
It's
Tulsi's
awesome.
been
It's awesome.
Yeah,
What he's
it's
done.
awesome. I think Tulsi, at the end of the day, what's really happening is just, especially, because you ran into the same thing, Kucinich ran into it, and Ron Paul ran into it. They don't like anti-war candidates at all. Like the military-industrial complex's power over the electorate is just ridiculous, and I think that's largely why they've went after her really hard. And I think that one of the other things that distresses me about how things are going is that so many of these progressive candidates' followers are turning on each other. Like, so Tulsi supporters who don't like Bernie supporters and Yang supporters who don't like either of them, and they won't work together. Meanwhile, on the centrist establishment side of things, well, we've seen that they'll certainly work together because they all dropped out and they all endorsed Biden, including the ones like Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, who said he was racist, a segregationist. They had all of these compelling things to say about him when everything started, and now all of a sudden they've forgotten all of that because they have to fall in line and do whatever the DNC wants. And it's unfortunate to me that the progressive side of things, I think some of them are just so emotionally attached to their candidate that they almost resent other candidates. Like, I get into arguments with Tulsi Gabbard supporters all the time because they feel that Bernie Sanders should have done more to try to get Tulsi into the debates or something like that. And I don't think they grasp that, aside from the fact that there isn't really much Bernie could do. Like, the media doesn't like him either. It's not like they would go, uh-oh, Bernie's mad at us, we should put Tulsi in the debates. But there's also the issue of dividing up the delegates that we have. I mean, Elizabeth Warren essentially seemed to be just siphoning votes off of Bernie's support base. And that seemed to be like her whole involvement in the election, which is unfortunate. But, and you still see it as you look at the different caucuses and the different primaries that have gone on, as you look at the amount that she has. And surprisingly, her delegate count is just enough to keep Bernie from, being neck and neck with Biden. I mean, the last primaries that we've had were just really uneven, so I don't know. But, it's not really in Bernie's best interest. It's not even in Tulsi's best interest. It's not in Yang's best interest. And at the end of the day, that he divides the vote further and then none of them get in, because that's essentially what I would fear would happen. I like all three of them. I wish that all three of them could be in the administration, together one way or the other. And I agree with your initial statement that Bernie and Tulsi paired together would have been an excellent group, especially considering that Tulsi seems to be running for the general election. And the reason I say that is that I have so many conservative friends that have said they would vote for her. I have a lot of libertarian friends that said they would vote for her. Ron Paul endorsed her. Gary Johnson, former, governor, Republican governor, and then libertarian candidate, endorsed Tulsi Gabbard. She brings all these people to the table that none of the progressives would have ever brought. And I think it would have been such a powerful ticket, especially since she's already said openly on Joe Rogan that Bernie was one of the only candidates that she would VP for. And it would have been a powerful ticket. And I think that what I'm concerned about is that they may be voting for Biden under the concept of being electable, but what I'm worried about is that Trump's entire game in politics is making fun of people, and Biden is just going to make that so easy. That's what concerns me, is that I don't, as far as like what goes forward, from my perspective anyway, it doesn't seem strategically sound to put Biden at the head of the ticket. There are other people, even on the corporate side, that could have done better. What is your insight about that?
Well, first off, I agree with your analysis, but I don't agree with your conclusion, and that is that Biden is the choice of the Democratic Party, but not just the Democratic Party. It's broader than that. Let me give you an example. In Massachusetts, Biden did not have an office, did not have any position at all, did not spend a penny, and he carried Massachusetts, a liberal state, overwhelmingly, and to the detriment of Bernie and to obviously the Warren. Now, how did that happen? And that's the analysis that I've placed on what's going on in areas where Bernie carried in 16. Now, the tragedy is that Bernie was cheated out of the nomination in 16 by Hillary, Perez, Wasserman Schultz, and none other than Barack Obama. And then we paid a price for that. That's what brought in Trump. Now, I don't have the same fear of Trump that others have. I think Trump is going to beat himself. He's been in the process over the last 3 years of beating himself. So he's strengthened his base. But boy, I'll tell you, his base, when they get hungry, they're going to go for their pocketbook, and that's not going to be Trump. But what I view, what happened with Bernie, is that what happened initially with Tulsi, and that is the military-industrial complex, which essentially has treated all our politicians, elected officials, as puppets for the last 30, 40 years. And so the person that frightened the military-industrial complex more than anybody else was Tulsi Gabbard. She had 6 years on Armed Services Committee. She knew where the bodies are buried. She had 6 years on Foreign Relations Committee. She knew the foreign policy areas. Now, Bernie has caught up on that, but Tulsi would make a tremendous contribution in that regard. So they had to annihilate Tulsi early on, and they did. They did, successfully. And, of course, mainstream media, which is the tool of the powers that be, the 1% elites who control our society, they control the mainstream media. There was not one question that addressed the 800-pound gorilla at the debate, and that was the actual robbery of the Treasury by the military-industrial complex. Not one question about war and peace and how we sustain war. So that's what we're facing. And so I early on, I got interested, but I came to the conclusion many years ago that representative government doesn't work, and it won't work until we solve the problem that was created by the founding and the framers of the Constitution in order to protect slavery. That's the reason why they didn't trust the people. But they made one very great mistake from their point of view. When they put out the Constitution, they said, "We, the people, do ordain." Well, that's right, but we didn't ordain it in 1776, 8, and 87, 88, 89. No, it was done by a minority of elites, but they made the mistake of selling it to the American people by saying, "We, the people, do ordain." Well, if you do ordain, it means you're godlike. And so if we ordain the Constitution, we can change the Constitution. And that's right there in the first lines of the Constitution. What happened in the Constitution, it did not keep faith with the Declaration of Independence, where we declared that all people are created equal. So we established a moral norm. And the first thing we did as a collective is violated when we wrote the Constitution.
That's a part of this that I think a lot of people don't grasp, and that comes back to what we were mentioning earlier, that people don't understand what was really going on when the Constitution was being formed or was being written, and who wrote it and why they wrote it. And one of the backdrafts for that, actually, I was watching Psy-War. I don't know if you've ever watched that movie. It's a really good movie about propaganda. But one of the things that they brought up in Psy-War was that there was a period right after we won the Revolutionary War where there were a whole lot of soldiers who never got paid, and they were pretty angry. And they were angry in particular at the wealthy of the country. And there were riots. There were all kinds of other problems that were going on at the time where massive amounts of the poor were like, "Hey, you guys, didn't take care of us. We just won this revolution for you, and now you're all still sitting here, fat cats with all kinds of money, and the rest of us are struggling because we went and fought a war for all these years, and we weren't planting crops or doing any of the things that people did to make money back then. And that was the real reason why they were so scared of the poor and also scared of democracy. One of the things I remember from your book, Citizen Power, was just pointing out that, like we brought up slavery earlier, was that there were states that would not ratify the Constitution by direct democratic election because it had slavery in it. And then there were states that wouldn't ratify it unless it had slavery in it. And so the wealthy interests obviously wanted to keep their slaves. I mean, even Thomas Jefferson, who's probably my favorite of the founding fathers, he owned more slaves than the rest of them, and so. And
he lived high on the hog on their backs.
Right, exactly. And that's a part of it that I bring up, like we were talking off the air before we got on. I was like, people bring up all the time, particularly the founding fathers, like they enshrine them and they say, the founding fathers' beliefs on property rights. I'm like, hey, let's stop that right there, because those people believe that people could be property, and I'm not saying that there can't be something good to come out of what they did. Like I said, there's things that Thomas Jefferson said that I like, that I found compelling, but we have to remember who these people were. They weren't trying to protect the common man. They weren't trying to protect, the poor. They weren't trying to protect the working class. They were trying to ensure that the people who are wealthy stayed in charge, which is why they liked the idea of, let's elect delegates to go to the Constitutional Convention. Let's lock the doors so that nobody can see what we're doing. If you did that now, if we turned off C-SPAN and the Senate went into, to session, in closed session, and nobody was allowed to see what was going on, nobody would stand for that. But that's the circumstances in which the Constitution was drafted. And most people are not aware of it because they don't talk about that in the history books. It's not to their best interest. But you, researching essentially the possibility of a constitutional amendment, you had to go look back at all that stuff. And that's not actually that far off. People tend to forget. Like, if you just sit and listen to the way that the Supreme Court has the debate with itself about, well, what did they mean? Like, for example, when they were doing the D.C. gun ban, they had to sit there and read letters between the founding fathers talking to each other about the Second Amendment to try to determine whether or not banning guns in D.C. was constitutional. That's how they always do things, because that's essentially what you're supposed to be figuring out when you're framing the Constitution is, well, what were they thinking at the time? And I think that people essentially have been, essentially brainwashed, so to speak. It's unpatriotic to say anything negative, and there's still great things that came out of the Constitution. I'm not trashing all over the whole thing, but a lot of those things were concessions. Like, that was another thing that got brought up in Cywar, was that the Bill of Rights was not what I believe the Federalists wanted at all. It was what the opposing side, wanted. And in order to be able to get the Constitution, they essentially had to make a concession. Okay, fine, we'll have a Bill of Rights. There were wealthy interests in the beginning who didn't want us to have, the Bill of Rights. And that's, so those are all the dark secrets about the Constitution. And in particular, one of the things I tell people to do is to watch the movie The Patriot, because in The Patriot, before there was a Constitution, now mind you, it's a fictional film, but one of the things that they definitely got right was that the colonies governed themselves by direct democratic processes. They got together and they had town hall meetings, everybody spoke, everybody weighed in, and then they casted lots to determine what would happen. And that included, ratifying the Constitution, and included even just like, are we going to support this war effort or that war effort? And if individual citizens didn't agree, they were still allowed to, essentially step aside and not be involved in whatever it is that group of people collectively decided. That's not how things are now. And people have also not really realized, when they say, well, democracy is evil. This is something I remember you saying actually during your final speech at the Libertarian Convention, was that they were so against democracy. And he's like, well, you guys are all democratically voting to elect which one of us is going to represent you. It's like, so it's either democracy or it's democracy. And elected officials are still democratically elected. It's not like there isn't still a system in place. So why is it somehow not two wolves and a sheep deciding what's for dinner to pick somebody else to make your decisions for you? Why? How is that supposedly superior? How does that supposedly protect our liberties? It doesn't. It gives us an illusion, but we're not any better off picking someone else to make our decisions, especially not if that person is carefully selected from a small handful of very wealthy people most of the time, okay? Those are the people we get to choose from, especially because we have that two-party system. So they pick who we can choose from, and if we try to vote for anybody else, we're quote-unquote throwing our vote away, which is why our third parties never get anywhere. And essentially we're very carefully kind of corralled into this, like this trough, so to speak, of column A or column B, and we're not given any choices outside of that. And before, the major thing that I think of really has changed things is that it used to be, in the days before the internet, people just picked their candidate based on what happened at the debates. And they completely controlled who got into those debates. So you didn't ever get exposed to other candidates outside of that. I mean, I look back on this now, because my son watches Jimmy Dore a lot. He watches Rising a lot. And I'm like, geez, you have no idea how good you have it, because programs like that did not exist when I was a kid. You got whatever Fox and NBC, whatever they wanted to give you, that's what you got. You would never even heard of them. And that's why I also pointed out, so like if Bernie had run in 2008, he'd have been standing right there next to you and Dennis and Ron Paul, because they'd have gotten rid of, him as fast as they could, and they don't have that power anymore. The internet has changed that, and they know that, and they're scared. I remember watching all those people like Chris Matthews. Oh God, I hate that guy. Chris Matthews, mouthing off because he was so upset that Bernie had won, and those talking heads just trying to wrap their heads around the possibility that Bernie Sanders won Iowa. Bernie Sanders, killed it, in New Hampshire. They couldn't even, to them that was just the world was, the sky is falling. They couldn't handle that at all, and I definitely think that I hope that people are listening to your message, that they can look at, read your book and look at this concept of direct democracy as another way to empower the people, because a lot of people have essentially been conned into believing that democracy will somehow be bad for them, and as opposed to letting the plutocracy control us. And that's the part about it, I think, that people forget, is that the plutocracy is in charge.
Well, you're right. We are ruled by a minority. And what I'm suggesting with this legislation is to be ruled by the majority. It's that simple. And so ruled by the minority with their power to control Congress is not a solution. And that's the reason why we will never see, when they talk about change, getting, let's say, single-payer health care, that's an important policy, because, as Bernie points out, we have a right to our health. But that's not fundamental change. Fundamental change is going to the Constitution and seeing how the people got screwed out of the process by the framers, not the founders, because it gets confusing. The framers of the Constitution are the ones that screwed the people and gave a lawmaking monopoly to the institution they created, which is the Congress. And that monopoly has not served us well. What we need is for the people to be able to participate in the lawmaking process. And the people are capable to do it. We have the technology to do it. We may not have had the technology back in 1787, but we have the technology to do it now. And what will happen when this becomes the law of the land, this will push technology even further to satisfy effectively the desires of the people to govern themselves. When we hear the statement, government of the people, by the people, and for the people, it's never been by the people. It's been by representatives, and that's the flaw in the process that exists today.
When you see so much, particularly, pardon for the interruption, but they're trying to tell us now we have to vote for Biden, and even if we don't want to, and it always comes down to this at the end of every election cycle, is that, it's like the same thing with Hillary last time. It's like, you had your run. Yeah, we entertained your notion, but now progressives, you better all line up because you got to vote for whoever we give you. You know,
That's right.
even if he's not.
That's right. But we can change that. And
Right.
and I had given up. First off, if Bernie had succeeded to get the nomination, he would have more problems getting his agenda through a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House. Because keep in mind, they are being purchased by the other forces. And so Bernie would be there fighting tooth and toenail for every one of the issues involved. And of course, that's how they would destroy him. They'd make him appear ineffective as a leader because he can't get the stuff through the Democratic Congress. Now, with what has happened, I'm very distressed over what's happened with this explosion of fear pushing Biden. But by the same token, this could be the result with a silver lining if Bernie would begin to buy into creating a legislature of the people. He would accomplish, as a senator, pushing for the legislature of the people more than he could accomplish as president. And if he understands that, boy, it's Katie bar the door in the support that we will have.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. And that is another aspect of it that people tend not to look at. People are so fixated on the president, and they don't even know who their congressman is 90% of the time. They have no idea.
Right.
You know, I ran for
takes
Congress.
place.
I ran for Congress in 2008, and the reality is on state level politics, people pretty much vote their party, and they don't even know who you are. They don't attend, debates for Congress most of the time. They don't watch them online. They don't attend forums. I mean, I would probably say when I would go to all these different voter forums as a candidate, there would be a dozen people there. Really, really smart voters go to that stuff. But the average person just goes, well, here's the Democrat, here's the, or the Republican, and they just vote down the party. And if you're a third party candidate, unless they're just, essentially voting.
Neil, that's the problem. Neil, that's the problem we're going to have in trying to educate the American public that they deserve to have the right to make laws. Will they understand that? And so the campaign, what I call the educational campaign, will have to turn around and get millions of people to buy the book and read it and question it, and then we turn around and go to have various meetings in every congressional district of the United States. That's the organization that we need to set up to just educate the people. Once they're educated and we have an organization, then it'll be easy to conduct the election following the pattern that I outlined in the book. So the key is to educate the people, and the only way you can educate them is to have them read the book and question it, discuss it around the country. My hope would be that if Tulsi didn't file for re-election, and I don't know what her plans are, but boy, I would love to see her become the executive director of this whole Philadelphia 2 national campaign. So
that would definitely be good to see.
Yeah, because
have you had an opportunity to speak to her about this?
Pardon me?
Have you had an opportunity to speak to her?
No, well, not about this. And I didn't want to bother her or Bernie with this. But now that it's come to this, then what I'm going to try to do is to get my kids, or if you want to, buy a copy of the book and send it to her. Send it to Bernie. I want them to get outside pressure rather than coming from me, using my personal friendship with her and with him.
Sure. No, I'll definitely pick it up. I loved your last book. I'm sure I'll like this one too. Now, one of the things that we didn't talk about today, and obviously this is directly affecting you now, but it's the coronavirus. A lot of people are afraid, and they're uncertain. And honestly, I mean, it's one of the reasons I can even do this show is that everything's shut down. I'm just stuck in my house, essentially. I remember talking to Skylar in the past, just kind of fantasizing about what it would have been like if you had been president. But so let's say Senator Mike Gravel wins the presidency in 2020. I don't know, maybe a write-in campaign. And you're in this situation where we need real leadership because what's going on with this virus has not been real leadership. What is it that you feel like that isn't being done that needs to be done? And just explain a little bit about your own experience with it being a senior. I mean, God, now you're 90. You're right in that red zone of the kind of people we're going to lose if this thing gets out of control.
That's right, and that's why I'm staying home. and my wife is under the same threat. She's 74. So no, I have no fear. At my age, I got more time than I probably deserve. But I've got some doctors that know me and know my background and spend a lot of time making sure that they can keep me alive. With respect to a leadership role, the leadership role is that the pandemic is such a frightening thing that it incapacitates a lot of people, but not the scientists. And that's the failure that what's his name, our president has done by
Donald Trump.
not putting the scientists in command. In other words, when you got a war, you don't need the military. You need the scientists to free up their. They know the problem. They live the problem all their careers, and so that's what should have happened. Now, fortunately, we had enough scientists that were honest enough to get media attention and to tell the truth about the stupidity and the incompetence that's gone on. And we haven't suffered the bulk of that incompetence because we have not had the testing in the United States, so we don't know how bad the situation is. Right now, we don't know. And the crudest form of what we're doing is lockdown. Take everybody out, destroy the economy, which is what's happening, because we don't have the tools that would have been necessary, and that is to test, and with the testing, follow the sources and all of the activities. So we have the great scientists. They're finally speaking up and standing next to Trump, who's trying to bask in their light, but it won't work. Trump has revealed himself to be incompetent in this regard, and to try and blame it on China. What the hell's that got to do with it? It's an assault by a virus that can begin anywhere in the world, and to attack people because it began in your country. I mean, it's ridiculous. And look at how the Chinese, they initially made the mistake of trying to cover up a problem, which is so typical not only of tyrants, it's typical of all politicians. If something's going wrong, and of course, Trump issued an order to keep the processes of analyzing what was going on at the beginning, to keep it secret. I mean, this whole thing started with, this is after watching China make that mistake and then correct it immediately. And now Trump sees that and does the same thing again. It's frightening. It's frightening to think it could be. When you hearken back to 1917, 18, my uncle died in the influenza. He never went into the service or went to war, but he died of influenza. And they had only been married for 6-7 months when this took place. And so I've lived, and my aunt stayed a widow all of her life as a result of that. And so it was something that was very much up front for us in our family, that the pandemic of 1819 did such a havoc on our personal lives. Now, what we're facing now, I think the threat is more serious in the United States than probably Africa and the poor. These are the people who just get wiped out in volume. And who's the British person that just recently made the statement, a former official made the statement, well, it's about time we clean out the poor, and this is the tool to do it. I mean, this is the Republicans and these kind of people are cruel. Obama, not Obama, but Trump, he cut food stamps. out for people. I mean, food stamps. When a person can't make it on their salary and you have to go to food stamps, it says something about the structure of your economic system. And our economic system is an abomination. And it's going to it's how it's going to be done. The fact that they feel they have to give money to people, that's not what they did in the last situation. They gave it to the banks. And the banks didn't even bother to help the people out. They just took advantage. People like Mnuchin, the Secretary of Treasury, he made his wealth off the backs of poor people in foreclosures. And these are the people in charge. Fortunately, this thing is so severe and everybody's so frightened that they turn to the scientists, who are the only knowledgeable people about what's going on. And so from me personally, I want to get another 3 years so that I can push Bernie and others to set up a legislature of the people. That's it for me. Once that's in place, I can go to my greater reward, and I hope I can do this in the next 3 years.
Well, I can tell you, Mike, that even if for some reason it doesn't get done, I'm going to keep telling people about it, and I only have so much power, obviously, but my radio show before I went on hiatus had roughly 800,000 listeners worldwide, and I'm hoping to grow that base again. But honestly,
great. Please do. And with your knowledge of this, you've got a hell of a memory. I'm impressed. But what it is that's the reason why I wrote the book. Until the kids discovered me and pushed me forward, I had given up. I just wanted to write the book so that hopefully somebody in the future will see this as a solution. Well, that solution is immediate, much more immediate than I thought possible. And that's the reason why if Bernie if he'd have got president, he would have had to go through the experience of not getting his agenda through Congress, and then he might have alighted on this. But now we don't have to wait for the election. We can start right after the convention doing our plotting and planning, and he would have access to millions of people with his criteria, and we would capitalize on that. So, and then plus at one point, the kids, had a website for me, which I never used, but they had over 40 million hits. Now, I don't know what a hit means in people passing through and seeing it, but now you take that body of people and the body of people that Bernie has as a ferocious, committed group of people to what he represents, not him as the person, but what he represents in a way of solving problems of human governance. That's what we want to capitalize on. And I got to tell you, this could be a very unique opportunity as a result of the virus and the incompetence and the dishonesty of the Trump administration. And of course, though we would have a very imperfect vessel in Biden. Here, let me give you one test of Biden, and I know Biden very well. He is a decent person, as Bernie says. Problem is whenever he's been faced with substantial judgment, he failed. He failed with Anita Hill, which gave us Clarence Thomas for 50 years in the Supreme Court. He failed with the war when he was, and he was chairman of the Judiciary Committee that was doing the hearings in this regard, and denied Anita the corroboration of two other women that weren't even bothered to be called up. The same thing he did when Biden was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He facilitated the enactment of the resolution that permitted Bush to go to war. And so now Biden, the benefit is that Biden's going to be too old to do a great deal, very much, other than just hold the government together for the Democrats, and they don't want to accomplish a great deal. They say they do, but watch what happens. When we went to war, keep in mind the Democrats controlled the Senate. when we put Clarence Thomas in office, the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate. So
Right.
So all we can do is Biden will be nothing more than a caretaker, placeholder, and with as a result of that, that leaves a clear shot of us to go out and to create a legislature of the people.
I think that's definitely a great way to look at how to move forward. And, I want to thank you, Mike, again for coming on and for everything that you've done, and I know that it's been difficult, for you as well, being you've always been so passionate and that you really care. That's something I remember saying to you off the air was that, there are candidates that you can tell when they care. You may not agree with everything they say, but they legitimately care. And then you can tell when they don't. Like Hillary Clinton just came across to me as soulless. That's why
you're so right. You're so right. Plus corrupt. She was taking
Right.
money from Wall Street with a shovel.
Right, exactly. And that's one of the reasons why people were, I wasn't Bernie or bust. There were other people that I would have voted for. The problem is that I made a vow to myself back in 2008 when you were running. I'm never voting for anybody who voted for Iraq. I'm never voting for anybody who voted for NAFTA. And I might stretch a little bit here or there, but I didn't vote for Hillary or Biden in 2008 over those two issues. I didn't vote for Hillary in 2016 over those issues, and I'm not going to vote for Biden in 2020 over those issues. And I think
you should re-examine that because we do need a placeholder. We need a warm body, and all we got to do
for your sake,
is take
I'll
his
consider
temperature.
it.
All we got to do is take his temperature every morning, make sure he's alive. But we need a placeholder, and Bernie feels that way too. And so I had some problems with my kids that they just went off the reservation and were misquoted by the New York newspaper, the Globe, or I forget which one. And it was an embarrassment because they were making statements that are really not representative of my views. I'm going to vote for Bernie. I'm going to vote for Biden. There's no two ways about it. In fact, and I'll make sure that look at him very closely. As he's healthy, can he make it to the inaugural? That's my concern.
Right. Well,
and I would predict that he will pick Amy Klobuchar to be his vice president, and she won't be all that great shakes, but then she'll be a talkative placeholder.
One of the things actually that you bring up, actually, that's something else that I've been wanting to say to the people on all these forums that I'm part of from these different candidates is that there are people who still are angry at Bernie for 2016 when he inevitably had to go ahead and try to help Hillary, which of course she seems to have completely forgotten about now, and her campaign people are still rabidly anti-Bernie now. And I'm sure that she's pulled some strings to try to give him problems, but the point is that Bernie supported Hillary because he didn't want Trump, and because it's basically kind of understood that that's what you should do. And then there are Tulsi supporters that I speak to who can't stand Bernie because he did that. And then I usually have to dig up that, eventually Tulsi Gabbard had to vote for Hillary Clinton too, and they don't believe it. And so then there's actually a link to an article where Tulsi Gabbard admits that she eventually had to do that. She didn't want to, but that's who they had, given the choice is what
it's
Tulsi
being
said.
realistic. You see, to not do that is anarchy. To say that, we're not going to have it, I can't, either my way or the highway, is anarchy. And we can't
Right,
do
and they're
that.
turning on Andrew Yang for doing the same thing. Andrew
well,
Yang supporters are angry at him.
Well, it's wrong. It's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is we have to have a government, and it has to operate. It operates very imperfectly, and under Trump it was a disaster. But it was a disaster on many times with the Democrats. Where do the Democrats get their money? They get it from Wall Street.
Sure.
And all of the presidents, Democrat or Republican, have been puppets of the military-industrial complex. The generals can say what they want to incite war and conflict. I mean, it's sickening. and all we do is let them pillage the treasury to create weapons. Here's a figure I saw just yesterday from CIPRI in Sweden, and that is that the amount of weapons into the global arms bazaar, 73% are the United States of America. Those are all our contractors that sell that we subsidize and let them make these weapons, and then they sell them into the world. And so, rather than giving, China is trying to raise the economic standard of the world, and we turn around and want to raise the weaponry volume in the world. It's a sick situation. And then when in the debate, Biden didn't even understand what Bernie was trying to talk about. I had sent Bernie a paper that was written by Chaz Friedman II, who in my mind would be the ideal Secretary of State. And he wrote a piece on China that was awesome. And I followed the China stuff very closely. And so I sent that to Bernie and to his chief of staff, because I think it was important for the chief of staff to also read it. And Bernie brought it up that, when you talk about freedom, who's brought about more freedom than anybody else in all of civilization? You have to ask yourself that question. Well, when freedom is not just being able to vote for the leader or the tyrant, the freedom is being able to have money in your pocket to be able to educate your children, to feed your family, to live a nice, decent life in middle class. China has, in the last 30 years, transferred 600 million human beings from poverty to middle class. That is an accomplishment that has never been acknowledged in the United States, and is the greatest accomplishment in human civilization. Now, that they don't have the freedom of the vote, well, I got to tell you, the voting is not all that what it's cracked up to be, as we see in our own situation. So,
well, that was
so
I agree with
when
that.
Bernie raised this, Biden couldn't even understand it. Didn't even understand what Bernie was talking about.
I don't think he possesses the scope, but they also have been, because it's so hard to find anything to yell at Bernie about, anything that they could twist or turn to try to find. It all came down about, well, you're speaking positive about a totalitarian evil regime, and it was like he didn't say anything positive about gulags or, executions. He didn't say any of that. Bernie's trying to be realistic about the fact that some of the things they did rose people out of poverty. And in regards to the communism and the socialism versus capitalism argument, one of the things that I tend to point out to people is that they're concerned about even what we call democratic socialism or social democracy. In the Nordic model, they talk about the high taxes and all that. And I said, okay, well, there's something to be said for the fact, however, that the United States is ranked number 27 in upward mobility, as in the likelihood that people who are born poor will become wealthier we are ranked number 27, whereas the Nordic countries are all in the top 5. And then there's, so apparently they're doing something right. Because
yes, they are. And there's two types of socialism. Excuse me. There's Republican socialism and there's democratic socialism. The question is who's the excuse me. The question is who's the beneficiary. With democratic socialism, the people are, and with Republican socialism, the elites are.
Right, exactly. That's something else I bring up to them all the time. They're constantly complaining about the 1.5% of people who are on welfare who are found to commit fraud. It's literally 1.5%. That's it. And they're so fixated on that. The conservatives are essentially. I actually read a piece once. It was really funny. It was an internet meme that said, Fox News, wealthy people paying other wealthy people to get middle class people to blame poor people. We focus so much on that 1.5% of the people on welfare that they call welfare queens who abuse welfare. And then we don't want to talk about the bank bailout. We don't want to talk about the money that went into the bank bailout and those people paid themselves bonuses of millions of dollars out of the bank bailout. They came to us and they told us, look, you got to give us this money or the whole economy is going to crash. And, and we did that. And then somehow, oh, well, okay, you fixed it. The economy didn't crash, but you also seem to find enough money to pay all of your executives millions and millions of dollars in bonuses out of taxpayers' money. And then what's worse is at the end of all of that, then they also got to keep all the real estate, kick everybody out of it, and then resell it. I'm like, but nobody wants to talk about that. The amount of money that went into the bank bailout, I mean, I don't have the hard numbers, but you could probably fund the food stamp program for 10 years, on that amount of money.
What went into the bailout was over $1 trillion.
Right. And nobody looks at it like that. They're essentially so fixated on, don't help the poor. They might abuse that, to the point that they don't look at that. And it's funny to me that they're just so tuned out of it. Essentially what it amounts to is that, people are, the two main parties are both kind of in the business of trying to figure out how they can best, get as much taxpayer dollars to benefit, their constituents, which is not the constituents of the people who are voting. It's the paying them for their campaigns, obviously. And they don't look at all the money that goes in directions that isn't helping anybody. And it's not even a new phenomenon. Like, because of, my time in the Zeitgeist movement, I checked out a book called War is a Racket, written by General Smedley Butler. And this was pre-World War II.
Smedley Darling Butler.
Right. Yeah, he knew. He described situations this is like pre-World War II, where they had like a bolt, or rather it was a wrench that's only used on one bolt that was not even used very often at all. Like there was 6 different things that we ever used this one bolt for. And he has the numbers in the book. You can actually find it for free online on PDF because it's so old.
Oh, no, I've read.
It's called War is a Racket.
I read about Butler a long time ago.
Right, and in this book, he detailed that they ordered 1 million of these wrenches, and nobody needs them. But somebody made money doing that. And the end of his point was to try to run for Congress, and I think he was going to eventually try to run for president. Was to bring attention to this fact that all the money, all the wars are fixated on money. And if there's no money to be made, then the war won't happen. Something I remember when we were having that in Darfur, there was this horrible genocide going on. Nobody was talking about sending any military over there. But when Iraq is rolling around, it's time for us to send the military because he gassed the Kurds 10 years ago. I mean, it's been even longer since then. But that was actually something Ron Paul pointed out. He's like, so we're going over to Iraq because you're concerned that he gassed his own people 10 years ago? He's like, why didn't you care about it back then? It probably has something to do with the petrodollar and all the money to be made with oil. I mean, he didn't elaborate that far, but, him arguing with Hannity was always crazy. Hannity was one of the pundits that just made me want to punch him in the face. And it was stuff like that, and I remember Stephanopoulos, that's another one. The fact that he even still has a job. I remember listening to him talk to you, and he was so condescending and so snotty. I was like, how does this guy get employed? I can't stand him. And I guess, on the plus side of it, that Chris Matthews was pretty nasty to you back in 2008 too, if I remember. And,
yes.
And now he's finally out of a job. Because he screwed up too much, and I'm actually kind of happy for that. The stuff he was saying about Bernie was so over the top, and finally even Fox News had enough of him, or it wasn't Fox. I'm sorry, I think he's CNBC.
MSNBC.
Right. Yeah, and he was, although the sexual harassment allegations are, the reason that they gave, it wouldn't surprise me if just the fact that he had committed so many faux pas at that point that the network was already upset with him might have been what emboldened those women to finally be willing to step forward and talk about it. Because a lot of the ones who want to report it, they're always concerned if this guy's high profile, is this going to hurt my career? So then he was finally on the ropes when he made those stupid comments like comparing, Bernie's people to brown shirts and then comparing his win in, I think it was in Iowa, or no, it wasn't in Iowa, it was in Nevada because it was so one-sided. He compared it to the Nazis storming France. He was already in trouble at that point. That was actually another one of your books that I remember reading was The Kingmakers.
Oh,
And
yes.
that was a good book, just discussing how much power the media has over who we elect as president. People don't realize just how much control they have. I mean, it's like, so Bernie sticks it to Biden in the last debate, and CNN is there quickly to do, damage control and try to make, oh, did you see how great Biden did in that debate? He clearly won this debate. CNBC is probably even worse. And they try to manipulate the way people think, and they're doing a pretty decent job of it still. But again, nowhere near as powerful as they were when you had to deal with them in 2008, and certainly not as powerful. I mean, I can't even imagine running for president before the internet, like in the 70s or something. I mean, think back to when you were a senator. Can you imagine, trying to run for president then as opposed to when the internet was around?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, well, look at how long have we been on at this point?
It's getting to be about that time, Mike. I understand. So, thank you very much for being on. And
well, thank you. First off, I want to stay in touch with you. So,
sure.
Would you make a point of contacting me every so often?
Absolutely. Thank you for being on. I'll definitely do that.
You have a wealth of knowledge and the ability to express your knowledge in a very articulate fashion. I really am impressed.
Well, thank you, Mike. I had a good teacher. It wasn't only you, but you were definitely a huge influence on the way that I communicate. So, and the courage about it. So thanks again, Mike, and thanks for being on. And we're definitely on way longer than we thought we would be. I appreciate you coming on again, and I will definitely keep in touch. You have my cell phone number now, and I'll probably reach out to you again, also just to see how things went with this broadcast for you, and hopefully have you on again in the near future.
Very good, and I'd be delighted.
Okay. So, well, thanks a lot, Mike. Did you have a website
keep your distance, from other people, and don't get infected. Okay.
I'm going to avoid that. Can you give us the name of your book one more time?
The name of the book is the Failure of Representative Government and the Solution, a Legislature of the People. The book is a manual to be able to create and operate a legislature of the people. And the book is only a little over 100 pages. You can read it in one sitting.
So, and obviously I would also recommend, if you haven't read The Kingmakers, The Kingmakers was an excellent book about the media's control over elections and other matters, also by Mike Gravel. So thanks again, Mike, for coming on. I'm going to say goodnight to you. Give my affection to your wife if she has any idea or remembers who I am. And thanks again.
And let's stay in touch, okay?
I will. Thanks again, Mike.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yep.